I was peeling apples for a small pie when my phone vibrated on the kitchen table. It was such an ordinary moment. The radio hummed softly in the background. The afternoon sun leaned gently through the window, warming the corner of the room. I remember thinking about how proud I was that my son was finally settling down, building his own family, creating a future I had once dreamed of for him when he was just a barefoot boy, running through the yard. I wiped my hands on my apron and picked up the phone. The message was short, cold, sharp. "Don't come to my wedding. My wife is uncomfortable." For a second, my mind refused to understand the words. I read them again slowly, out loud, as if my voice might change their meaning. "Don't come." Those two words felt heavier than any insult. They carried years of memories with them. First steps, scraped knees, school performances, late-night talks, quiet prayers I whispered over his sleeping face. I sat down at the small kitchen table because my legs suddenly felt unsure. The knife slipped from my fingers and tapped softly against the plate. The pie was forgotten. So was the sunlight. So was everything except the ache growing in my chest. I waited for another message to follow. Maybe an explanation. Maybe an apology. Maybe even a joke that went too far. But nothing came. I stared at the screen until it went dark. For months, I had been involved in every detail of that wedding. I helped choose decorations. I sent money when they said they were short. I even offered to host relatives who would travel from far away. I had imagined sitting quietly in the back row, holding tissues, watching my son become a husband. Now I wasn't even allowed to enter the room. I walked slowly to the bedroom and opened the closet. Hanging there was the simple blue dress I had bought just for that day. I touched the fabric gently as if it could feel my sadness. I remembered standing in the store, smiling at my reflection, thinking, I want to look nice when I see my son get married. With trembling hands, I folded the dress and placed it back on Thea's shelf. That small action broke something inside me. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. I didn't scream. I didn't call him immediately. I didn't beg to be included. Instead, I sat on the edge of my bed and let the truth settle. I had been removed from a moment that every mother dreams of. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, every sacrifice. Every time I had put his needs before my own. I wondered when love had turned into something conditional. When being a mother had started to feel like standing outside a locked door. And in the silence of that dark room, I felt something new rising inside me. Not anger, not hatred, but the slow, painful beginning of clarity. Because when someone tells you that your presence is unwanted, you finally understand where you truly stand. And that understanding changes everything. The morning after the message, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your thoughts louder. I lay in bed for a few minutes, staring at the pale light creeping through the curtains, feeling the weight of yesterday still pressing on my chest. My first instinct was to reach for my phone to see if he had written again, if regret had softened his words overnight. There was nothing. No message, no missed call, just silence. I made myself tea and sat at the small table by the window. The cup warmed my hands but not my heart. That was when I made a decision that felt both frightening and necessary. For years, I had been supporting my son financially. Even after retirement, I sent money every month. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself young families struggle. I told myself a good mother gives without counting. But somewhere along the way, my help stopped being appreciated and started being expected. So I put on my coat and walked to the bank. Each step felt heavy, like I was walking against my own instincts. I had been trained by love to give, to sacrifice, to remain quiet. Turning that habit around felt unnatural, almost selfish. But I kept walking. At the bunk, I sat across from the young clerk and asked her to cancel the automatic transfers. My voice shook slightly, but I didn't stop. I closed the savings account I had created for their future home, the one I had added to little by little, skipping small comforts so they could have something bigger. When she handed me the receipt, my hands trembled, not because of the money, because I knew this decision would change everything. I didn't tell my son what I had done. I didn't send a dramatic message. I simply returned home, cooked lunch for myself, and waited. That evening passed quietly. The next morning passed, too. Then, on the second afternoon, my phone finally rang. I recognized his number instantly. My heart jumped foolishly, hoping he might call to apologize. But his voice told me otherwise. "Mom," he said carefully, "the payment didn't go through. Is something wrong with your account?" I closed my eyes for a moment before answering. "No," I said softly. "There's nothing wrong with the account. I just decided to stop." There was a long pause on the other end. "You stopped," he repeated, confused. "But we need that money right now. Not how are you? Not I'm sorry about the message. Not did I hurt you. Only need." That was the moment it truly hit me. My absence at the wedding didn't bother him as much as the absence of my financial support. "I've helped as much as I could," I replied calmly. "Now I need to take care of myself." He sighed, sounding irritated, not concerned. The call ended shortly after, cold and rushed. I sat there holding my phone, staring at the wall. It hurt more than I expected, but beneath the pain, something else appeared. Relief. For the first time in years, I felt like I had drawn a line, not in anger, not in revenge, but in quiet self-respect. And even though the silence that followed was heavy, I knew it was necessary because sometimes the quiet after you stop giving reveals the truth louder than any argument ever could. It was early evening when I heard the knock. Not loud, not urgent, just firm enough to demand attention. I was standing by the sink, washing dishes, when the sound echoed through the small house. For a moment, I pretended I hadn't heard it. My heart already knew who it would be. Somehow, the silence from the past 2 days had prepared me for this moment. When I opened the door, they were standing there together. My son looked thinner, tired around the eyes. His shoulders were stiff, as if he had practiced this visit in his head. His fiancée stood slightly behind him, holding her purse close to her chest, avoiding my gaze. Neither of them smiled. "Mom," my son said quietly. I stepped aside and let them enter without a word. Inside, they sat on the couch side by side, leaving a careful space between themselves and me. I went to the kitchen and made tea, not because I wanted to be polite, but because I needed the few minutes to breathe and steady myself. When I returned, they began speaking before I even sat down. She spoke first about wedding stress, about misunderstandings, about how emotions were high and people sometimes say things they don't mean. Her voice was controlled, almost rehearsed. My son nodded beside her, adding small comments about pressure and finances. I listened quietly. Not once did either of them mention the message that broke my heart. Not once did they ask how I felt. Not once did they say sorry. When the room finally went silent, they looked at me, waiting. I placed the teacups on the table and sat down slowly. "I heard everything you said," I began, keeping my voice soft. "But you didn't come here to talk about feelings." They shifted uncomfortably. "You came because the money stopped." My son opened his mouth to argue, but I gently raised my hand. I respected your decision about the wedding. I continued. I didn't fight. I didn't beg. I stayed quiet. But respect goes both ways. The fiancé finally looked at me then, surprised. I have supported you for years, I said, not because I was rich, not because it was easy, but because I loved my son and I believed I was part of his life. My voice trembled slightly, but I didn't stop. When I was told not to come, I understood something important. If I am not welcome as a mother, I cannot continue as a bank. The room felt heavy. My son tried to explain again. He said weddings cost money. He said I was being too sensitive. He said I should understand. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not a boy anymore, but a man who had forgotten where he came from. I do understand, I replied quietly. I understand that I need boundaries. They left shortly after. No shouting, no dramatic scene, just quiet disappointment on their faces. When I closed the door behind them, I leaned against it for a moment and closed my eyes. My heart hurt, but I also felt something else. Strength, because for the first time in my life, I had chosen dignity over fear, and that choice, though painful, felt like the beginning of my freedom. The day of the wedding arrived quietly. No music echoed through my house. No hurried phone calls. No last-minute excitement. Just soft morning light and the slow ticking of the clock on the wall. I woke up early as I always did, but this time there was no heaviness in my chest. Instead, there was a strange calm, the kind that comes after you finally accept a painful truth. I made myself breakfast and carried my tea outside to the small garden behind the house. The air was cool. The sky was clear. I could almost imagine the wedding happening somewhere far away. Laughter, decorations, photographs being taken. But it felt distant, like a story that no longer belonged to me. Instead of sitting in sadness, I picked up my gardening tools. I planted new flowers where old ones had withered. I pressed the soil gently round the roots, careful and patient. As I worked, I realized how similar it felt to rebuilding my own life. Slow, quiet, intentional. Later that afternoon, I put on a simple dress. Not the blue one meant for the wedding, but something comfortable. I walked to the community center and attended a small gathering I had been avoiding for months. People greeted me warmly. They asked how I was. They listened when I spoke. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen. Weeks passed. The phone grew quieter. The requests for money disappeared. The messages became short and polite. And strangely, with every quiet day, I felt lighter. One evening, there was another knock on my door. This time, it was my granddaughter. She ran into my arms and held me tightly. "Grandma," she whispered, "I missed you." That hug healed something deep inside me. I realized then that love doesn't always come from the places we expect. Sometimes it arrives softly, reminding us that we still matter. Months later, my son sent a short message. "I hope you're doing well." I stared at the screen for a moment before replying. "I am," I wrote. "I truly am." And it was the truth. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to punish anyone. I didn't need revenge. What I needed was self-respect. I learned that giving endlessly without boundaries does not create love. It creates dependency. I learned that silence can be stronger than shouting. And I learned that choosing yourself is not selfish. It is necessary. Now, when I look at my reflection, I don't see a forgotten mother. I see a woman who finally stood up gently, quietly, and firmly. And that is my victory. Not loud, not dramatic, but peaceful.